In the heart of a noisy, fast-paced city lived a man who was always chasing something, but he wasn't quite sure what. His days blurred together in a haze of work deadlines, late-night takeout meals, and endless scrolling on his phone. He had everything people said would make life better: a fancy apartment, a sleek car, and a job that paid well. But deep down, he felt empty. Like there was this void inside him that no amount of money or distraction could fill. This man liked to call himself Ethan, though most people around him barely noticed him anymore. He wasn't rude or unpleasant. He just existed in a way that didn't demand attention. At work, he was efficient but distant. With friends, he showed up when it mattered, but never stayed long enough to really connect. Even at home, surrounded by gadgets and comforts, he often found himself staring at the walls, wondering why nothing seemed exciting anymore. One evening, after another long day at the office, Ethan sat slumped on his couch, flipping through channels without really watching anything. Everything felt the same: predictable, dull, uninspiring. Then an idea struck him. Maybe what he needed was something different, something real. Not another binge-worthy series or hours lost online, but something that actually made him feel something. He grabbed his phone and started searching for events happening nearby. Scrolling past concerts and comedy shows, he stumbled upon an advertisement for a small local theatre performance. It wasn't flashy or over the top, just a simple poster with a picture of a woman holding a guitar and a tagline that read, "Stories that stay with you." Intrigued, Ethan booked a ticket. What did he have to lose? The night of the show, Ethan walked into a tiny, dimly lit theatre tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was nothing like the glitzy venues he occasionally visited. There were no neon lights or velvet ropes here, just rows of wooden chairs and a modest stage adorned with a single spotlight. The audience was small, maybe 30 people tops, but there was a warmth in the air that immediately put Ethan at ease. As he settled into his seat, he couldn't help but notice how different this felt from his usual Friday nights. No loud music pounding in his ears. No crowded bars filled with strangers shouting to be heard. This place was calm, almost sacred. For the first time in ages, Ethan felt present, not thinking about emails waiting in his inbox or notifications buzzing on his phone, just here. When the lights finally dimmed and the performer stepped onto the stage, Ethan leaned forward slightly, curious. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her presence magnetic, yet unassuming. As she began to speak, her voice soft but steady, Ethan realized this wasn't going to be just another performance. It was something more. And for the first time in years, he found himself genuinely interested in what came next. The performer on stage didn't waste any time trying to impress the audience with flashy tricks or over-the-top theatrics. Instead, she began by simply introducing herself. Her voice was warm, like someone you'd trust instantly, and her smile had a way of making everyone feel like they were part of something special. She explained that she wasn't there to entertain in the traditional sense, but to share stories, real, raw, and honest ones. Stories about life, love, pain, and hope. She started with a tale about growing up in a small town where dreams often felt too big for the space they occupied. The way she described it, you could almost picture the dusty streets, the creaky wooden houses, and the endless fields stretching beyond the horizon. She spoke about how hard it was to leave everything familiar behind when she moved to the city, chasing a dream that even she couldn't fully define. Her words painted vivid pictures, and Ethan found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed. Then came the music. Between her stories, she played songs on her guitar. Simple melodies that carried so much weight, they seemed to echo in the room long after the last note faded. One song was about losing someone dear, a friend who left too soon, and how that loss taught her to cherish every moment. Another was about finding strength in vulnerability, about learning to let people see your cracks instead of hiding them. Each lyric felt like it was written just for him, as if she somehow knew exactly what he'd been feeling all these years without ever saying it out loud. What struck Ethan most wasn't just her talent, it was her authenticity. There was no pretense, no attempt to be anything other than who she truly was. She laughed at her own mistakes, admitted moments of weakness, and celebrated small victories as if they were the greatest achievements. It was refreshing, almost disarming, to witness someone being so open in front of strangers. He realized he hadn't seen that kind of honesty in a long time, not from others, and certainly not from himself. As the performance went on, Ethan noticed something else. The audience wasn't just listening, they were feeling. You could see it in their faces, the way some nodded along while others wiped away tears. A middle-aged man sitting 2 rows ahead kept glancing at his wife, holding her hand tightly whenever the performer hit an emotional chord. An older woman near the aisle closed her eyes, swaying gently to the rhythm of the music, as though it reminded her of memories buried deep within. For the first time, Ethan understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than yourself. To connect with others through shared emotions, even if those emotions weren't always happy ones. By the time the intermission arrived, Ethan felt like he'd been given a glimpse into another world, one where people weren't afraid to face their truths. He stepped outside to catch some air, still processing everything he'd heard. The cool breeze brushed against his face, grounding him back to reality. As he stood there, lost in thought, the performer unexpectedly walked out onto the sidewalk, too. She looked different off stage, less polished, more human. Their eyes met briefly before she gave him a polite nod and lit up a cigarette. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then decided to say something. "That was incredible," he said awkwardly, unsure how to put his feelings into words. "You made me think tonight," she smiled softly, exhaling a puff of smoke. "Sometimes thinking is the first step toward feeling again," she replied, her tone casual, yet profound. For a second, Ethan didn't know how to respond. But something about her answer lingered in his mind, planting a seed he couldn't ignore. Ethan stood there on the sidewalk, unsure of what to say next. The performer's words hung in the air between them, simple, yet heavy with meaning. He wasn't used to conversations like this. Most of his interactions these days were surface level. Quick chats at work, casual banter with acquaintances, or small talk with strangers. But here he was, face to face with someone who seemed to see right through him, even though they'd just met. The silence stretched for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt real. Like the kind of quiet that happens when 2 people are both thinking deeply, even if they're not saying anything out loud. Finally, Ethan broke the pause. "I don't usually go to stuff like this," he admitted, gesturing toward the theatre behind them. "Honestly, I didn't know what to expect," she chuckled softly, taking another drag from her cigarette. "Most people don't," she said with a shrug. "They come because they're curious, or bored, or maybe trying to escape something. Doesn't matter why they show up, though. It's what they take away that counts." Her response caught him off guard. It wasn't judgmental or pretentious. It was honest, and somehow that made it easier for him to keep talking. "I guess I came here tonight because, well, I've been feeling stuck lately. Like, everything's fine on paper, but nothing feels real anymore. Does that make sense?" To his surprise, she nodded without hesitation. "Oh, it makes perfect sense," she replied. "A lot of us feel that way at some point. We chase things we think will make us happy, money, success, distractions, but they only fill the space temporarily. Eventually, the emptiness comes. Back, louder than ever." Her words hit close to home. Ethan shifted his weight awkwardly, stuffing his hands into his pockets. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but he couldn't, because deep down, he knew she was right. "So, what do you do about it?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now. "How do you fix it?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him for a moment before answering. You don't fix it, she said simply. At least not in the way you're probably thinking. You can't outrun it or bury it under more distractions. The only way out is through. You have to sit with it, listen to it, figure out what it's trying to tell you. Ethan frowned, processing her advice. That sounds harder than fixing it, he muttered, almost to himself. It is, she agreed with a small laugh. But it's also worth it. Once you start paying attention, you'll realize that the answers were always there. You just weren't ready to hear them. They stood there for a few more minutes, chatting casually about random things. The weather, the city, the quirks of performing in small venues. But beneath the surface-level conversation, Ethan could feel something shifting inside him. For years, he'd avoided looking too closely at his own life, afraid of what he might find. But now, standing here with this stranger, who spoke with such clarity and conviction, he felt a flicker of courage. A tiny spark that whispered, maybe it was time to stop running. When the bell rang, signaling the end of intermission, she stubbed out her cigarette and gave him a warm smile. Thanks for coming tonight, she said sincerely. And thanks for sticking around to talk. Not everyone does. Ethan returned. The smile, though he still felt a little uncertain. Thanks for making me think, he replied. As he turned to head back inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter might be the beginning of something important, something he didn't fully understand yet, but something he was ready to explore. After the show ended, Ethan didn't want to leave. He lingered near the exit, watching as the performer greeted a few audience members who approached her with words of gratitude. Some hugged her, others simply shook her hand or exchanged a few heartfelt sentences. It was clear that her performance had touched people deeply, leaving them with something they couldn't quite put into words, but felt profoundly, in their hearts. Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should join the small crowd gathering around her. He wasn't good at this kind of thing, expressing emotions or connecting with strangers on such a personal level, but something inside him pushed him forward. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the lingering weight of the conversation they'd shared outside earlier. Whatever it was, he found himself walking over and waiting patiently until she finished speaking with the others. When it was his turn, she looked up and smiled, recognizing him instantly. "Hey, you stayed," she said warmly, her tone light but genuine. "Yeah, I did," Ethan replied, scratching the back of his neck nervously. "Your show, it really got to me. I haven't stopped thinking about what you said earlier." She tilted her head slightly, studying him for a moment before gesturing toward a nearby bench. "Want to sit down? My feet are killing me after being on stage all night." Relieved that she seemed open to continuing their chat, Ethan followed her to the bench. They sat side by side, the cool night air wrapping around them like a comforting blanket. For a while, neither spoke. They just sat there, listening to the distant hum of city life and the occasional laughter drifting from a nearby cafe. Finally, she broke the silence. "So, tell me more about what's been going on with you," she said gently. "You mentioned feeling stuck earlier. What does that look like for you?" Ethan sighed, leaning back against the bench. He wasn't used to opening up like this, especially to someone he barely knew. But there was something about her calm demeanor that made it easier. "I guess it's like, I have everything I thought I wanted. A good job, a nice place to live, all the stuff people say will make you happy. But none of it feels meaningful anymore. Like, I go through the motions every day, but I don't actually feel anything." She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "That happens when we lose touch with ourselves," she said. "We get so caught up in chasing goals or meeting expectations that we forget to ask why we're doing it in the first place. Have you ever stopped to think about what truly matters to you? Not what society tells you should matter, but what makes you come alive?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. Truthfully, he hadn't thought about it in years. Or maybe he had. But he'd pushed those thoughts aside because they were uncomfortable. Admitting that he didn't know what mattered to him felt like admitting failure, and Ethan hated the idea of failing at anything. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, staring at the ground. "I mean, I used to love creating things, writing stories, even playing music when I was younger. But somewhere along the way, I stopped doing those things. Life got busy, responsibilities piled up, and I guess I convinced myself they weren't important anymore." She listened intently, letting him speak without interrupting. When he fell silent, she placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Those things you love doing, they're still part of you," she said softly. "They didn't disappear just because you stopped paying attention to them. Sometimes, reconnecting with who we are means going back to the things that once brought us joy." Her words lingered in the air, sinking in slowly. Ethan realized she wasn't just offering advice, she was sharing wisdom born out of experience. There was no judgment in her voice, only understanding. And for the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as a title or a paycheck, but as a person with dreams, fears, and untapped potential. As the night wore on, their conversation deepened. She shared snippets of her own journey, how she'd struggled with self-doubt, how she'd almost given up on performing altogether, and how she eventually learned to embrace vulnerability as a source of strength. Listening to her, Ethan began to see glimmers of hope, a path forward, however uncertain it might be. By the time they parted ways, Ethan felt lighter, as though a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had begun to lift. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to start looking for them. Over the next few weeks, Ethan found himself returning to the small theatre again and again. It wasn't just about seeing the performer. He wanted to soak in the atmosphere, to be surrounded by people who seemed more alive than he'd ever felt. Each time she performed, her words struck a deeper chord within him. He began to notice patterns in her stories, recurring themes of resilience, self-discovery, and the courage it takes to face your own truth. Slowly, but surely, those themes started weaving themselves into his life. Between performances, they kept talking. Sometimes it was brief, a quick chat after the show, or an exchange over coffee when their schedules aligned. Other times, they'd sit for hours, diving into conversations that left Ethan both inspired and unsettled. She had a way of asking, questions that cut straight to the core. "What are you afraid of?" she asked one night. Not failing at work or losing money, but really, truly afraid of. Ethan hesitated before answering. "I guess I'm afraid of looking back on my life and realizing I wasted it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid that I'll never figure out what I'm supposed to do with all this. Potential everyone keeps telling me I have." She nodded thoughtfully, as if she'd heard variations of this fear countless times before. "Potential is tricky," she said. "It's like holding an unopened gift. You can carry it around forever, imagining how amazing it might be. But until you unwrap it, it's just weight. The only way to lighten the load is to start using what's inside." Her metaphor stuck with him long after their conversation ended. That night, lying awake in bed, Ethan realized she was right. For years, he'd been clinging to the idea of who he could become, instead of focusing on who he already was. He didn't need to reinvent himself overnight. He just needed to reconnect with the parts of him that still mattered. The changes began subtly. At first, Ethan started small, setting aside time each evening to write in a journal, something he hadn't done since college. Writing felt awkward at first, like trying to flex muscles he hadn't used in years. But slowly, the words began to flow. Memories resurfaced, childhood dreams, old passions, moments of joy he'd forgotten existed. Through writing, he started piecing together fragments of himself, rediscovering the person he'd buried under layers of obligations and expectations. Next came music. One weekend, while cleaning out his closet, he stumbled upon an old guitar, tucked away in the corner. Dust covered its surface, but the strings still hummed faintly when he plucked them. Tentatively, he strummed a few chords, laughing at how rusty his fingers felt. But as he played, something shifted inside him. Music had always been his escape back in the day, a way to process emotions he couldn't put into words. Now, it became a bridge between the man he used to be and the man he wanted to become. As these creative outlets re-entered his life, other changes followed naturally. He cut back on late-night binges of TV shows and endless scrolling through social media. Instead, he spent evenings exploring hobbies he'd abandoned years ago, painting, reading poetry, even taking long walks without headphones to simply listen to the world around him. These small acts of presence made him realize how much of his life he'd been living on autopilot. One day, during another post-show conversation, Ethan shared some of his recent progress with her. "I've started volunteering at a community center," he said, surprising even himself with the admission. "They run workshops for kids from low-income neighborhoods, art classes, storytelling sessions, stuff like that. I figured maybe I could help out, share some of what I've learned." Her eyes lit up with genuine pride. "That's incredible," she said. "You're not just finding yourself, you're helping others find pieces of themselves too. That's powerful." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. For so long, he'd chased success in ways that left him empty. Now, he was beginning to understand that true fulfillment came not from achieving more, but from giving back, from creating connections that went beyond surface-level interactions. Though their relationship remained rooted in friendship, Ethan knew she'd given him something far greater than romance. She'd handed him a mirror, forcing him to confront the cracks in his own reflection, and then shown him how to piece it back together. Every step forward felt like shedding another layer of the numbness that had weighed him down for so long. And for the first time in years, he felt alive, not because of anything external, but because of the quiet, steady rhythm of rediscovering who he truly was. Months turned into a year, and Ethan's transformation became impossible to ignore, not just to himself, but to everyone around him. His co-workers noticed the change first. Gone was the man who used to clock in and out mechanically, always glued to his phone or buried under piles of paperwork. In his place stood someone who seemed genuinely present, someone who listened when others spoke, offered thoughtful advice during meetings, and even cracked the occasional joke that made the office feel lighter. But the biggest shift happened outside of work. The community center where he volunteered had become his second home. At first, he'd only planned to help with logistics, setting up chairs, organizing supplies, making sure everything ran smoothly. But over time, he found himself stepping into roles he never imagined. He started teaching creative writing workshops for teenagers, encouraging them to put their thoughts into words and their dreams onto paper. Watching their faces light up as they discovered their own voices reminded him of how it felt to rediscover his own. One evening, after a particularly lively session, one of the kids approached him shyly. "Hey, do you think I could ever write something people would actually want to read?" the boy asked, clutching a crumpled notebook to his chest. Ethan smiled, remembering the same question he'd once asked himself. "Absolutely," he said firmly. "But here's the thing. You don't write for other people. You write because it makes you feel alive. If you can do that, trust me, others will feel it too." The kid nodded slowly, looking down at his notebook like it held secrets waiting to be unlocked. Moments like these fueled Ethan's passion. They reminded him why he'd chosen this path, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. As his confidence grew, so did his willingness to step out of his comfort zone. One day, the director of the community center approached him with an idea. "We're hosting a storytelling event next month," she explained. "It's open mic night, and we're inviting volunteers to share personal stories. You've got such a gift for connecting with people. I think you should consider sharing your journey." Ethan froze. Sharing his story, out loud, in front of strangers. The thought terrified him, but deep down, he knew it was exactly what he needed to do. For years, he'd hidden behind titles and achievements, afraid to let anyone see the messy, uncertain parts of him. Now, he understood that those imperfections were what made him human and relatable. He agreed. though his stomach churned with nerves in the weeks leading up to the event. On the night of the performance, he stood backstage, palms sweaty and heart racing. The performer, the woman who had unknowingly set all of this in motion, was sitting in the front row, smiling up at him encouragingly. When his name was called, he took a deep breath and walked to the center of the stage. For the next 10 minutes, Ethan poured his heart out. He talked about feeling lost, about chasing empty goals, and about the moment he realized life wasn't about escaping discomfort. It was about embracing it. He shared how music and writing had helped him reconnect with himself, and how volunteering had taught him the value of giving back. By the time he finished, the room erupted in applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from genuine appreciation. Afterward, several people came up to thank him, telling him how much his story resonated with them. One woman hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know I wasn't alone in feeling this way," she whispered. Her words stayed with him long after the event ended, reminding him of the power of vulnerability. That night, as Ethan sat on the curb outside the venue, the performer joined him once again. "You were incredible," she said simply, lighting up a cigarette. He laughed nervously, still buzzing from adrenaline. "Thanks. Honestly, I wasn't sure I could do it." "You already did," she replied. "And look at you now, helping others find meaning, just like you did." Her words filled him with gratitude, not just for her, but for the journey that had brought him here. She hadn't changed his life by giving him answers. She'd done it by asking the right questions. And now, he was learning to pass that gift forward, one story at a time. Years passed, and Ethan's life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The man who once spent his evenings staring at screens or wandering aimlessly through crowded bars now stood confidently on stages, not as a spectator, but as a storyteller. He traveled to small towns and big cities alike, sharing his journey with audiences hungry for authenticity. His talks weren't polished TED-style presentations. They were raw, honest conversations about struggle, growth, and the messy beauty of being human. One evening, after wrapping up a performance in a cozy little venue, Ethan stepped outside to catch some fresh air. As he leaned against the wall, watching people trickle out into the night, he spotted her, the performer who had changed everything for him. She looked older now, her hair streaked with silver and lines etched around her eyes. But her smile was as warm as ever. "You're getting good at this," she teased, walking over to join him. "I almost felt like I was listening to myself out there." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "If anything, I'm just borrowing your playbook. You taught me how to tell a story that sticks." She waved off the compliment modestly, though her pride was evident. "Nah, you figured it out yourself. All I did was plant the seed. You're the one who made it grow." They stood there for a while, reminiscing about the early days, the tiny theatre, their late-night chats, the first time he'd nervously admitted feeling lost. It felt surreal to look back on those moments now, knowing how far he'd come. Back then, he'd been searching for answers without even realizing what questions to ask. Now, he lived every day with purpose, helping others navigate their own paths. Their friendship had deepened over the years, though it remained rooted in mutual respect rather than romance. They checked in on each other occasionally, exchanged messages when inspiration struck, and always found time to meet whenever their schedules aligned. To Ethan, she wasn't just a friend. She was a mirror, reflecting back the best parts of him when he struggled to see them himself. As the night grew cooler, Ethan glanced toward the emptying venue. "Do you remember that first show I saw you perform?" he asked, nostalgia softening his voice. "I didn't know it then, but that night changed everything for me," she smiled knowingly. Funny how life works, isn't it? One random decision. You walk into a theatre instead of staying home, and suddenly the whole trajectory shifts. He nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, and now here we are. Me telling stories, you still inspiring people. It's kind of amazing, don't you think?" "It is," she agreed. "But you know what's even more amazing? That you're using your experiences to help others. That's the real gift, not finding yourself, but helping someone else find their way. Her words lingered long after. They parted ways that night. Driving home, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on how much his perspective had shifted. Once, he'd believed happiness came from external achievements, money, status, possessions. But now he understood that true fulfillment came from within, from living authentically and connecting deeply with others. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through his window, Ethan sat down at his desk with a cup of coffee and opened his journal. Writing had become a daily ritual, a way to process thoughts and capture moments before they slipped away. Today, he wrote about gratitude, for the stranger who became a mentor, for the courage to change, and for the countless lives he'd touched along the way. Looking back, Ethan realized something profound. The woman hadn't given him entertainment that night in the theater. She'd given him a lifeline, a reminder that life's greatest lessons often come wrapped in unexpected packages. And now, he carried that lesson forward, weaving it into every story he told and every connection he made. In the end, Ethan learned that the most meaningful journeys aren't about escaping reality, they're about diving deeper into it, about embracing the highs and lows, the triumphs and failures, and finding beauty in the imperfect tapestry of human existence. And as he continued sharing his story with the world, he hoped others would do the same, creating ripples of change that stretched far beyond themselves.